I think it would be an unforced error for us to hand away the relationships and the competition with China that are metrics-based and transparent that the MCC has put in place. So I hope to work with you on that. Last, your testimony highlights an America First Opportunity Fund as a flexible and responsive account that will address waste in foreign assistance and be more agile. But at least as I see it in your proposal, the account replaces $9 billion of programs with a $3 billion account to cover everything from countering the PRC, countering Russia, aiding Jordan and others. Could you just briefly describe how you imagine that math working and how this fund being sufficient to meet a wide menu of needs?
Well, part of it is we found that
when a Republican senator has to stop a Secretary of State mid-pitch and ask how $9 billion turns into $3, that's not budgeting. That's a power grab. Today, you're going to watch Marco Rubio sell America First as efficiency, and you're going to see the oversight alarm go off on the record.
I wanted to touch on a few things that you and I worked on that I think deserve continued support and that I think are important for us to sustain. Senator Graham and I worked to pass the Global Fragility Act in 2019. You were a co-sponsor. It was signed into law by President Trump. And it's designed to save literally billions of dollars by addressing root causes of terrorism in fragile countries. As you put it at the time, as the U.S. responds to humanitarian crises, we must address the factors driving instability and violence. It's both moral and international security to promote stable and prosperous countries, and I'm proud to introduce this legislation. I'm planning to work with Senator Graham on reauthorizing it this year. The primary implementing entity had long been the Bureau of Conflict Operations and Stabilization. That's a bureau that's been restructured. Do you still agree it's in our national interest to have a targeted strategy to address the root causes of terrorism? And will you work with us to sustain the capabilities we need in the State Department to continue the Global Fragility Act's work?
Yes, and let me add to that because it's a good example. Number one, part of the reorg, just because we got rid of an office, named something, doesn't mean the function goes away. It means that we want to drive that through the regional bureau. So a great example of global fragility, I keep going back to this over and over again, is Syria.
Yep.
And if we don't, if that fragility is not addressed, there's going to be terror. There already is. I mean, ISIS is already growing there and potentially growing even more dangerous. If there's a civil war in Syria, you're going to have an ungoverned space where multiple groups are going to break out and not just threaten the region, but ultimately potentially the homeland. So it's a great example of how global fragility can be applied to the real world, but we have to do it very quickly. We have to be able to act quickly in this regard, which is one of the things we hope to do by being able to drive this down to the regional and local levels.
I also work closely with Chairman Graham, with Chairman McCall, with Ranking Member Meeks, and over 100 co-sponsors of both parties to enact the U.S. Foundation for International Conservation. It was enacted through the NDAA. There's funding allocated to it. You stated in your confirmation on January 15th that this was the sort of public-private partnership that struck you as deserving of support, and I would hope you would move quickly to execute creating it. It simply requires your signature, and obligating the funds and appointing the board. Chairman Graham and I are also working on a similar bill that would address food insecurity, again through a public-private partnership, a foundation that would rely on as much private sector funding and philanthropy as government funding. Do you still support these foundations, and is this something you look forward to working with?
And we'll get you an answer. I mean, we'll get you a decision on that very quickly, which is what you're looking for, is us to go through and try to implement the law.
Yes.
I recall the plan correctly. We'll get to that fairly quickly. We've had a lot going on over the last 4 months, but we'll get to it, including 100 and something reports that we inherited that were overdue. We're working through those as well. But because you raised it here today, if you give me a few days, I'll get you an action on it.
Thank you. We have spoken about the MCC. The Millennium Challenge Corporation is a Bush-era initiative that used metrics and accountability, working against corruption and in long-term partnership with countries to give them an alternative to Chinese financing. As you've described it, and I agree, debt trap financing. There's current compacts active in countries like Indonesia, the Solomon Islands, Nepal, Kiribati, where it gives transparency and cost sharing. You are the chair of the board of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. I understand from our discussion this morning that you're aware it's in some transition. Can you just confirm it's going through reform and will not be shut down wholesale?
Yeah, I can confirm. We're on the board. We don't operate it, obviously. We're on the board, but it's not a State Department function. We are one of the board members, albeit the chair, and actually our deputy, Chris Landau, is serving in that role when I'm not available to be at these meetings and so forth. My understanding as of the latest updates that I've gotten with the work that's being done is it is undergoing a reform effort, or streamline effort, but not a takedown effort.
I think it would be an unforced error for us to hand away the relationships and the competition with China that are metrics-based and transparent that the MCC has put in place. So I hope to work with you on that. Last, your testimony highlights an America First Opportunity Fund as a flexible and responsive account that will address waste in foreign assistance and be more agile. But at least as I see it in your proposal, the account replaces $9 billion of programs with a $3 billion account to cover everything from countering the PRC, countering Russia, aiding Jordan and others. Could you just briefly describe how you imagine that math working and how this fund being sufficient to meet a wide menu of needs?
Well, part of it is we found that some of these programs underneath it were scattered, some of them were duplicative, there were some inefficiencies. So we truly believe, now what the right number is, obviously, that's what we'll have to work with you on, but we truly believe that we can deliver on the same goals for substantially less than what those combined pre-existing funds or projects would have cost. But what it's going to enable us to do is to ensure that assistance funds are directed towards the highest priority projects that we may have on any given basis, on any given moment, given global events that are happening. It provides enough, in addition to these existing programs, it provides us being nimble enough to deal with a contingency in a world that rapidly evolves, as opposed to having to go back and repurpose existing funds to do it. So that's really the goal of the fund, is to be able to move at the speed of relevance when it comes to global events and not have to wait for the next funding cycle to come across or work through some reprogramming process that could take time for us to be able to respond quickly.
I do think, as a former senator, I hope you'll agree that there has to be a modicum of consultation, review, and approval by this subcommittee and others. But the target of agility, responding to world events, I suspect you'll get bipartisan support for that. But there needs to be a congressional role in oversight and accountability. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
When you watch this exchange closely, what makes it so revealing is who's asking the questions. This isn't some viral grandstander chasing cable news clips. It's Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat with a long bipartisan track record, laying down a basic constitutional boundary. If you're going to reform USAID, reform foreign assistance, restructure authorities, and shift spending priorities, you do it with Congress, not around Congress. Because the fight here isn't only about what programs survive, it's about who gets to decide and how much sunlight is allowed into the process. And right out of the gate, Rubio reaches for the oldest shield in Washington. Just because we got rid of an office name doesn't mean the function goes away. That sounds comforting, but it's also convenient, because moving a function into a different bureau, scattering it across regions, and calling it streamlining can make it harder to track, harder to audit, and easier to run on autopilot. You can keep the mission statement on paper while quietly changing the pipeline. And once you control the pipeline, you control what actually happens in practice. Then there's a moment that looks small, but it's a big tell. The senator brings up a law that's already been enacted. Funding has been allocated, the mechanism is set, and he's basically saying, this only needs your signature, the obligation of the funds, and the board appointments. That's not an ideological debate. That's implementation. And Rubio's answer is, give me a few days. If you're hearing that and thinking, so why hasn't it been done yet? You're asking the right question. Because when execution gets delayed on something bipartisan and already funded, it usually means the department is either buried in backlog, stalling for leverage, or deprioritizing anything that doesn't fit the new branding. On the Millennium Challenge Corporation, Rubio actually gives away the truth. He calls shutting it down an unforced error. In other words, handing away relationships and influence for free, especially in competition with China. So notice the pattern. Lots of language about reform and streamlining, a few acknowledgments that some tools are strategically valuable, but very few hard guardrails that tell you what's protected, what's being cut, and who signs off. And then we hit the heart of the whole clip, the math. The senator points out what everyone at home immediately notices. You're talking about replacing around $9 billion worth of programs with a $3 billion America First Opportunity Fund that's supposed to cover everything from countering China and Russia to supporting allies like Jordan and more. That's not just a budget question. It's a credibility test. Rubio's defense is essentially there was duplication, inefficiency, scattered programs, and we can deliver the same goals for substantially less. But trust us, we found inefficiencies isn't a strategy. It's a slogan. Because when 9 becomes 3, something doesn't get streamlined. Something gets cut. And the danger isn't only the cuts, it's the packaging. A flexible mega fund sounds nimble and responsive, especially when Rubio sells it as moving at the speed of relevance. But that's exactly why Congress gets nervous, because the more flexible the pot of money becomes, the easier it is to move priorities politically, to reward some partners, punish others, and make major foreign policy decisions through budget mechanics with less scrutiny. Agility can be real, but agility without oversight becomes a blank check. That's why the most important line isn't even Rubio's. It's the senators closer. Yes, you might get bipartisan support for being faster and more responsive, but there has to be consultation, review, approval, and a congressional role and accountability. That's the alarm bell going off in real time, because if foreign assistance turns into a branded America First slush fund, justified by buzzwords like efficiency and speed, it stops being policy made in the open and becomes power exercised in the dark. And the whole point of these hearings is to keep that from happening.